The morning sun cast long shadows across the tree-lined streets of Georgetown as Dr. Maya Richardson adjusted her rearview mirror. She was running a few minutes behind schedule for her guest lecture, but she remained calm and focused on the road ahead. Her dark blue blazer was perfectly pressed, and her briefcase sat securely in the passenger seat, containing her lecture notes on constitutional law and civil rights. At 42 years old, Dr. Richardson had earned every achievement that decorated her resume. With 2 PhDs, numerous published works, and a teaching position at Georgetown University's prestigious law school, she had overcome countless obstacles to reach her current position. Yet despite her accomplishments, she still found herself dealing with the same prejudices she had faced throughout her career. The familiar streets of her daily route passed by as she mentally reviewed her lecture points. The coffee shop where students gathered, the old bookstore with its worn brick facade, and the park where she sometimes ate lunch during warmer days. Everything was normal until red and blue lights suddenly flashed in her mirror. Dr. Richardson carefully pulled over to the curb, positioning her car properly and turning off the engine. She placed both hands on the steering wheel, just as her father had taught her years ago. Through her mirror, she watched a white police officer approach, his hand resting near his hip. "License and registration," the officer demanded, not bothering with a greeting. His nameplate read, "Officer Morrison." "Good morning, officer," Dr. Richardson replied calmly, maintaining her professional demeanor. "May I reach for my documents in my purse?" The officer nodded curtly, and she slowly retrieved her license and registration, handling them over without sudden movements. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Officer Morrison's tone was sharp, accusatory. "No, sir, I don't," she answered truthfully. "You ran right through that stop sign back there," he said, pointing behind them. "Didn't even slow down." Dr. Richardson furrowed her brow, certain she had made her usual complete stop. She had driven this route hundreds of times and knew every traffic sign by heart. "Officer, I'm quite sure I came to a complete stop. I always do, especially at that intersection." "Are you saying I'm lying?" Officer Morrison's voice rose slightly. "I saw what I saw. You trying to tell me how to do my job?" "No, sir," Dr. Richardson replied, keeping her voice steady despite her rising frustration. "I'm simply stating what I remember doing. Perhaps we could check if there's any traffic camera footage." The officer scoffed. "Listen, lady, I don't have time for this. You were speeding through a residential area, endangered children who could have been present, and now you're being argumentative." Dr. Richardson wanted to point out that there hadn't been any mention of speeding before, but she knew from both personal and professional experience that challenging an officer's authority rarely led to positive outcomes. Instead, she remained silent as he wrote the ticket. "That'll be $300, Officer Morrison announced, thrusting the citation through her window. "Next time, try following basic traffic laws instead of making excuses." Dr. Richardson accepted the ticket, noting how the fine seemed unusually high for a stop sign violation. "Thank you, officer," she said quietly, tucking the citation into her briefcase. As the police car pulled away, she sat for a moment, gathering her thoughts. The whole interaction had taken less than 10 minutes, but it had left her feeling drained. Glancing at her watch, she realized she would now be late for her lecture on equal protection under the law, an irony that wasn't lost on her. Starting her car again, Dr. Richardson made a mental note to request the intersection's camera footage. In her 20 years of driving, she had never received a ticket, and something about this entire situation felt wrong. But for now, she had eager law students waiting to learn about the Constitution's promise of equal justice, even if reality sometimes fell short of that ideal. She pulled back into traffic, her mind already formulating plans to contest the citation. If there was one thing Dr. Maya Richardson understood well, it was the importance of standing up for what's right, not just for herself, but for everyone who faced similar situations without the knowledge or resources to defend themselves. 2 weeks after the traffic incident, Dr. Maya Richardson walked into the county courthouse, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. The building was busy with morning activity, filled with lawyers in pressed suits and citizens waiting for their cases to be called. She had chosen to wear her best charcoal gray suit, her hair neatly styled, and carried herself with the confidence of someone who had spent countless hours in courtrooms, though usually as an expert witness, not as a defendant. The traffic court was on the second floor, room 204. Dr. Richardson arrived 20 minutes early, taking a seat in the wooden benches and observing the proceedings before her case. Judge William Harrington presided over the courtroom with an air of impatience, barely looking up from his papers as he handled case after case. Next case, Judge Harrington called out, his voice carrying the weariness of someone who had already heard too many excuses that morning. Miss Richardson. Dr. Richardson stood, straightening her jacket. Yes, Your Honor. Though I prefer Dr. Richardson, if you please. Judge Harrington glanced up briefly, his expression revealing mild annoyance. Miss, Doctor, or Mrs. It doesn't change the fact that you're here for a traffic violation. How do you plead? Not guilty, Your Honor, Dr. Richardson replied firmly. I brought evidence to support my case, including my spotless driving record of 20 years and a request for the traffic camera footage from the intersection in question. The judge shuffled through some papers on his desk, barely acknowledging her words. Officer Morrison's report states that you ran a stop sign and became argumentative when confronted. Is this correct? No, Your Honor. I respectfully disagree with Officer Morrison's account. Dr. Richardson began, maintaining her professional tone. I came to a complete stop, as I always do at that intersection. I'd also remained calm and professional throughout our interaction, despite. Miss Richardson, Judge Harrington interrupted, emphasizing the miss with supple disdain. Are you suggesting that a decorated officer with 15 years of service would fabricate a traffic violation? The courtroom had grown quiet, other waiting defendants watching the exchange with interest. Dr. Richardson took a deep breath before responding. Your Honor, I am merely presenting my version of events. As someone who has spent their career studying and teaching constitutional law, I understand the importance of. This is traffic court, Miss Richardson. Judge Harrington cut her off again, his tone growing sharper. We're not here for a lecture on constitutional law. The fact that you continue to argue and question the officer's judgment only confirms his report about your attitude. Dr. Richardson felt her face grow warm, not from embarrassment but from the effort of maintaining her composure. She had faced similar treatment before, the dismissiveness, the interruptions, the subtle and not-so-subtle signs of disrespect, but she hadn't expected it from a judge. Furthermore, Judge Harrington continued, given your apparent inability to accept responsibility for your actions, I'm increasing the fine to $500. Let this serve as a reminder that traffic laws apply to everyone, regardless of their credentials. The way he said credentials carried a clear tone of skepticism, as if he doubted her claims about her profession. Dr. Richardson stood perfectly still, her back straight, face composed, though her hands clasped tightly together in front of her. Will that be all, Your Honor? She asked quietly. Unless you'd like to argue further and risk additional penalties, Judge Harrington replied, already looking down at the next case file. You have 30 days to pay the fine. Next case. As Dr. Richardson gathered her belongings and walked out of the courtroom, she felt the familiar weight of injustice settling on her shoulders. But unlike many others who faced similar treatment, she had the means and knowledge to challenge it. She pulled out her phone and began composing an email to her colleague who organized the upcoming legal ethics conference. She had just found the perfect real-world example to include in her keynote speech, a speech that, ironically, Judge Harrington was scheduled to attend. Sometimes, she thought, the best lessons come from unexpected places, and this lesson was far from over. Later that evening, Judge William Harrington adjusted his tie as he entered the grand ballroom of the Riverside Hotel. The annual Legal Ethics Conference was one of the most prestigious events in the state's judicial calendar, and he had been looking forward to it for weeks. The chandelier-lit room was filled with judges, lawyers, and legal scholars from across the country, all gathered to discuss the future of justice in America. William, good to see you made it, called out Judge Martinez, his colleague from the district court. I saved you a seat near the front. You won't want to miss this keynote speaker. They say she's brilliant. Harrington nodded, making his way through the crowd. He had skimmed the conference program earlier, but hadn't paid much attention to the speaker's details. All he knew was that she was some professor from Georgetown who specialized in constitutional law and reform in the justice system. The traffic court was brutal today, Harrington complained as he settled into his chair. You wouldn't believe the attitude some people bring in. This one woman actually tried to lecture me about constitutional law in the middle of a simple traffic violation hearing. Before Judge Martinez could respond, the lights dimmed slightly, and the conference director approached the podium. Distinguished colleagues, it is my great honor to introduce our keynote speaker for this evening, the director began, his voice carrying across the now quiet room. She holds 2 PhDs, has published numerous groundbreaking papers on judicial reform, and currently serves as a professor of constitutional law at Georgetown University. Her recent work on addressing systemic bias in our courts has been praised by the American Bar Association. Please welcome Dr. Maya Richardson. Judge Harrington's mouth went dry. He sat frozen in his chair as a familiar figure walked confidently to the podium. It was the same woman he had dismissed and fined just hours ago, though she now wore a deep purple suit instead of the gray one from court. His mind raced back through their interaction, seeing it in a horrifyingly new light. "Thank you for that kind introduction," Dr. Richardson began, her voice clear and commanding. "Today, I'd like to discuss something that affects every level of our justice system, the subtle and often unrecognized biases that shape our decisions." As she spoke, Judge Harrington sank lower in his chair. Each point she made seemed to highlight his own behavior from earlier that day. She discussed how seemingly minor interactions could reveal deep-seated prejudices, how dismissiveness and disrespect often mask themselves as proper procedure. Just today, Dr. Richardson continued, "I witnessed firsthand how these biases can manifest in our courtrooms." She didn't look directly at Judge Harrington, but he felt the weight of every word. When authority figures refuse to acknowledge credentials, interrupt explanations, or escalate penalties based on perceived attitude, they reveal the very biases they might deny existing. The audience listened intently, many nodding in agreement. Some took notes. Judge Martinez leaned over and whispered, "Powerful stuff, isn't it? Makes you think about your own blind spots." Harrington barely heard him. His mind was replaying every moment of that traffic court session, how he had repeatedly called her Miss, despite knowing her proper title, how he had cut off her explanations, how he had increased her fine without real cause. Each memory brought a fresh wave of shame. Dr. Richardson's presentation continued for another 30 minutes, but for Judge Harrington, time seemed to stand still. When she finally concluded to enthusiastic applause, he remained seated, unable to join in the standing ovation that followed. As the crowd began to mingle during the reception, Harrington noticed Dr. Richardson speaking with several Supreme Court justices who had attended the conference. They treated her with the respect she deserved, the respect he had failed to show. "I need to get some air," he muttered to Judge Martinez, loosening his tie as he hurried toward the exit. The weight of his earlier actions was becoming unbearable. For the first time in his 15 years on the bench, Judge William Harrington felt like the one being judged, and he knew the verdict wasn't in his favor. Judge William Harrington couldn't sleep that night. The ceiling of his bedroom seemed to mock him as he lay there, replaying the day's events in his mind. His wife, Linda, had noticed his unusual quietness when he returned home from the conference, but he couldn't bring himself to explain what had happened. At 2 a.m., he finally gave up on sleep and walked to his home office. The moonlight filtered through the windows as he sat down at his desk and opened his laptop. His hands trembled slightly as he logged into the court's security system. As a judge, he had access to all courtroom footage, though he had rarely felt the need to review it before. He found the video from that morning's traffic court session and pressed play. The footage was clear, showing the courtroom from multiple angles. He watched himself on the screen, seeing his behavior through new eyes. There he was, barely looking up as Dr. Richardson entered. He noticed how he cut her off repeatedly, his tone dismissive and impatient. The security footage had no audio, but he remembered every word, especially his repeated use of Miss, despite her polite correction about her title. "What kind of judge am I?" he whispered to himself, rubbing his tired eyes. He opened another window and began searching through Dr. Richardson's professional profile. Her achievements were extraordinary. Graduated top of her class from Harvard Law, earned 2 PhDs, authored 3 books on constitutional law, served as a consultant to the Supreme Court, and won numerous awards for her work on judicial reform. The very kind of legal scholar he had always admired. And he had treated her like an argumentative traffic offender. But something else was bothering him, a deeper concern that went beyond this one incident. He opened his case files from the past month, then the past year. As he reviewed his records, a disturbing pattern emerged. The clock ticked past 3 a.m. as he made notes, comparing fines and sanctions. He found himself using different colored sticky notes to mark cases involving different demographics. Yellow for white defendants, pink for minorities, blue for men, green for women. As the pattern grew clearer, his stomach tightened. The evidence was right there in his own records. Minorities consistently received higher fines. Women, especially women of color, were more likely to have their explanations cut short. He had been harsher with certain groups without even realizing it. Judge Harrington stood up and walked to his window, looking out at the quiet street below. In 20 years of practicing law and 15 years as a judge, he had prided himself on being fair and impartial. He had even given speeches about the importance of equal justice under the law. Yet here was proof that he had failed to live up to those principles. He thought about his own daughter, Sarah, now in her second year of law school. What if someone treated her the way he had treated Dr. Richardson? The thought made him feel sick. At 4 a.m., he returned to his desk and began writing. First, he drafted a formal apology to Dr. Richardson, then stopped and deleted it. No, this required more than just an apology. He started a new document, titling it Proposed Changes for Traffic Court Procedures. As the first light of dawn began to creep through his window, Judge Harrington had filled several pages with notes and ideas. He knew that admitting his biases was only the first step. Real change would require action, new procedures, and a complete overhaul of how he conducted his courtroom. His wife found him there at 6 a.m., still in his clothes from the previous day, surrounded by papers and sticky notes. "William, have you been up all night?" Linda asked, concerned. He looked up at her, his eyes tired but clear. "I've made a mistake, Linda, a serious one. But more importantly, I've discovered something about myself that needs to change." As he began to explain the situation to his wife, Judge Harrington realized that this sleepless night marked the beginning of a new chapter in his career, one that would require courage, honesty, and a willingness to confront his own prejudices. The next morning, Judge Harrington arrived at his chambers 2 hours earlier than usual. Dark circles under his eyes revealed his sleepless night, but his mind was sharp with purpose. He had already called in his clerk, James, and requested all traffic court records from the past 3 years. "Everything, Your Honor?" James had asked, surprised by the unusual request. "Everything," Harrington confirmed. "And James, I need you to help me create a spreadsheet. We're going to look at patterns in my rulings." As James wheeled in cart after cart of files, Harrington sat at his desk, his coffee growing cold beside him. He opened his laptop and created categories: gender, race, age, fine amounts, whether he had interrupted the defendant's testimony, and if he had increased fines due to perceived attitude. "Your Honor," James said carefully, watching the judge work, "may I ask what prompted this review?" Harrington paused, thinking about Dr. Richardson's dignified presence at the conference. "Let's just say I received a wake-up call about blind spots we might not know we have." Hour after hour, they worked through the files. James read out the details while Harrington entered them into his spreadsheet. Patterns began emerging, each more disturbing than the last. The average fine for white defendants was $120, while for minorities it was $275. Women of color were interrupted during their testimony 72% more often than white men. Around noon, Judge Martinez stopped by, surprised to find Harrington's chambers looking like a research library. "What's all this, Bill?" Martinez asked, picking up one of the files. Harrington looked up, his face tired but determined. "Remember that speaker from last night? Dr. Richardson." "Of course. Brilliant presentation on systemic bias." "Well, what I didn't tell you is that I had her in my courtroom yesterday morning. Traffic violation. I dismissed her explanations, interrupted her repeatedly, and doubled her fine because I didn't like her attitude." Harrington's voice was heavy with shame. "I didn't even know who she was until I saw her at the conference." Martinez whistled softly. "That must have been uncomfortable." "It was enlightening," Harrington corrected. "And now I'm finding that it wasn't an isolated incident. Look at these numbers." He turned his laptop around, showing Martinez the spreadsheet. His colleague's eyes widened as he scrolled through the data. "The disparity in fine amounts is significant," Martinez noted, his professional tone masking his surprise. and these interruption patterns are clear evidence of bias, Harrington finished. My bias. James, who had been quietly organizing files, spoke up. If I may, Your Honor, what do you plan to do with this information? Harrington stood up and walked to his window, looking out at the courthouse square below. People were going about their daily lives, many heading to various courtrooms, trusting in the system to treat them fairly. First, we expand this research. I want to look at every type of case I presided over, not just traffic court. Then we bring in an independent reviewer to verify our findings. He turned back to face them. And finally, we make changes. Real, concrete changes. He picked up a legal pad where he had been jotting down ideas. Mandatory bias training for all court staff, regular review of ruling patterns, a new procedure for handling complaints about judicial conduct, and a system for defendants to provide anonymous feedback about their courtroom experience. It won't be comfortable, he admitted. Some of our colleagues won't like having their decisions scrutinized this way, but comfort isn't the point. Justice is. Martinez nodded slowly. You know, Bill, this could affect your chances for appointment to the appeals court. Then so be it, Harrington replied firmly. I took an oath to uphold justice equally. If I'm not living up to that oath, I need to fix it, regardless of the consequences to my career. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across his chambers, Judge Harrington looked at the mountains of files still to be reviewed. This was just the beginning of a long journey, but for the first time in his career, he felt like he was truly serving justice. A week after the conference, Dr. Maya Richardson sat in her Georgetown University office, grading student papers on constitutional law. The afternoon sun streamed through her window, highlighting the numerous awards and degrees on her walls. A knock on her door interrupted her work. Dr. Richardson. Her assistant Sarah poked her head in. There's a letter here from the county courthouse. It's marked personal and confidential. Maya accepted the envelope, immediately recognizing the official courthouse seal. Inside was a formally typed letter requesting a meeting with Judge William Harrington, along with a copy of her traffic citation marked Dismissed. She read the letter twice, noting its humble and professional tone. 3 days later, Maya stood outside Judge Harrington's chambers. She had chosen to wear the same purple suit from the conference, a subtle reminder of their last encounter. His clerk, James, opened the door and ushered her in. Judge Harrington rose from behind his desk as she entered. Gone was the dismissive demeanor from traffic court. Instead, he looked tired but earnest, his face showing the weight of serious reflection. Dr. Richardson, thank you for coming, he said, gesturing to a chair. Would you like some coffee or water? Water would be fine, thank you, she replied, taking the offered seat. James brought water for both of them and quietly left, closing the door behind him. For a moment, neither spoke. The thick folder of statistics and data Harrington had compiled sat on his desk between them. Dr. Richardson, he began, then paused and started again. I owe you more than an apology. I owe you an explanation, and more importantly, I owe you action. Maya sat quietly, her expression neutral but attentive. She had experienced many apologies in her career, some sincere, others merely professional courtesy. She waited to see which this would be. After your keynote speech, Harrington continued, opening the folder, I spent several nights reviewing my court records. What I found was disturbing. He pushed several charts across the desk. These show clear patterns of bias in my rulings, not just against you, but against many others who came before my court. Maya leaned forward, examining the data. Her academic training quickly recognized the significance of the patterns he had uncovered. The disparities are significant, she noted, her voice professional but not unkind. They're inexcusable, Harrington corrected. I've spent my career believing I was fair and impartial. Your case, your presence at the conference, it forced me to confront my own prejudices. He stood and walked to his window, hands clasped behind his back. I'm not here just to apologize, though I am deeply sorry for how I treated you. I'm here to ask for your help. Maya raised an eyebrow, intrigued. My help? Yes, he turned back to face her. I'm implementing new procedures in my courtroom to address these biases. Mandatory training, regular reviews of ruling patterns, anonymous feedback systems. But I need someone who understands these issues deeply, someone who can help ensure these changes create real impact. Maya studied him carefully. In her years of studying and fighting systemic bias, she had learned to recognize genuine commitment to change. What exactly are you proposing, Judge Harrington? I'm proposing a partnership, he replied. Your expertise in constitutional law and judicial reform, combined with my position within the system. Together, we could create a model for addressing bias in local courts. Maya stood and walked to a framed copy of the Constitution hanging on his wall. You understand this won't be comfortable, she said. Real change never is. I know, he nodded. But comfort isn't what I'm seeking. Justice is. She turned back to him, a slight smile forming. Then let's begin with your data. These patterns you've identified, they're just the surface. We need to dig deeper, look at intersectionality, examine the language used in your rulings. As they began discussing specific changes, both felt the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about one judge and one professor. It was about transforming a system, one courtroom at a time. 6 months after their meeting, Judge Harrington's courtroom looked very different. Gone was the rushed atmosphere of assembly line justice. Instead, a new sign hung outside room 204. Equal justice under law. Every case matters. Inside, the changes were even more noticeable. This morning, a young Hispanic woman stood before him, charged with a parking violation. In the old days, he might have rushed through her case. Now, he listened carefully as she explained in broken English about her sick child and the hospital emergency. Your Honor, his new court translator Maria stepped in. She says she has the hospital documents to verify her story. Thank you, Maria, Harrington nodded, reviewing the papers. Ms. Rodriguez, I understand the emergency situation you faced. The fine is dismissed, but please be aware of emergency parking zones in the future. The woman's relief was visible as she left the courtroom. James, his clerk, made a note in the new tracking system they had implemented. Another suggestion from Dr. Richardson. Every decision, every fine, every interaction was now documented and reviewed for patterns of bias. During the lunch break, Harrington met with his newly formed mentoring group. 5 young lawyers from diverse backgrounds sat around the conference table, sharing their experiences and challenges in the legal system. This program had been one of Dr. Richardson's key recommendations, creating pathways for underrepresented groups in the judiciary. The biggest challenge, said Andrea, a promising African-American lawyer, is being taken seriously by some of the older judges. Harrington nodded, remembering his own past behavior. That's exactly why we need more diverse voices in our courts. Tell me more about your experiences. Back in his chambers, he reviewed the monthly bias assessment report. The numbers were encouraging. The racial disparity in fine amounts had decreased by 67%, interruptions during testimony had dropped significantly, and satisfaction ratings from minority defendants had improved markedly. His phone buzzed with a text from Linda, his wife. Don't forget about your speech at the law school tomorrow. He smiled, thinking about how much had changed. These days, he regularly spoke at law schools about recognizing and addressing implicit bias. His own story, including his treatment of Dr. Richardson, had become a powerful teaching tool. Later that afternoon, he observed his court staff attending their weekly bias training session. The trainer, recommended by Dr. Richardson, was discussing microaggressions and their impact on court proceedings. Even small actions can send big messages, the trainer explained. When we rush people, interrupt them, or dismiss their titles and credentials, we're telling them they don't matter. Harrington watched his staff engaging with the material, asking questions, sharing experiences. The same clerk who once rushed through cases now spoke about the importance of giving everyone a fair hearing. At the end of the day, he received an email from the state Supreme Court. They were interested in implementing his reforms across all district courts. His methods were showing measurable results, and other judges had noticed. As he packed up his briefcase, Judge Martinez stopped by. Quite a change from 6 months ago, Martinez observed, looking around at the transformed courtroom. You know, when you started all this, some people thought you were just trying to save face after the Dr. Richardson incident. Harrington shook his head. It was never about saving face. It was about saving our integrity as a justice system. He picked up a framed photo from his desk, a group picture from last month's judicial reform conference. In it, he and Dr. Richardson stood with a diverse group of judges and lawyers, all committed to creating a more equitable justice system. The hardest part wasn't implementing the changes, he said, putting the photo back. It was admitting I needed to change in the first place. As he walked out of the courthouse that evening, Harrington noticed a young black woman hesitating near the entrance, clutching some papers. She looked nervous, like many people did before their court appearances. "Good evening," he said kindly as he passed. "Remember, every case matters here." The woman straightened up slightly, a bit of tension leaving her shoulders. It was a small moment, but to Harrington, it represented everything they had been working toward. A court where everyone could expect to be treated with dignity and respect. 1 year after their first meeting, Dr. Maya Richardson stood again in Judge Harrington's courtroom. This time, she wasn't there as a defendant but as part of an official evaluation team from the American Bar Association. The room was packed with observers, including judges from other districts eager to learn from what had become known as the Harrington model. Maya watched as a middle-aged white judge from Texas took notes on his laptop. Next to him, a young female judge from California filmed the proceedings on her phone with permission. What had started as one judge's personal awakening had grown into a movement for change. Judge Harrington entered the courtroom, and Maya noticed how different his entire demeanor was from a year ago. He moved with the same authority but carried himself with more awareness, more humanity. The "every case matters" sign above his bench had become more than just words. "Good morning, everyone," he addressed the court. "Today's proceedings are being observed as part of our ongoing commitment to transparent and equitable justice. Please proceed as normal." Throughout the morning, Maya and her team documented everything. They noted how the court translator was readily available, how the clerk made eye contact with each person who approached, how Harrington listened carefully to every case. The numbers in their report told an impressive story. Bias complaints down by 85%, appeal rates reduced by 60%, and public trust ratings at an all-time high. During the lunch break, Maya met with Harrington in his chambers. The office had changed too. The walls now displayed artwork from local community artists, and a shelf held books on racial justice and ethical leadership. "I just received the preliminary report from the Bar Association," Maya said, opening her laptop. "Your court is now being recommended as a national model for bias reduction in the justice system." Harrington smiled modestly. "It's not just my work. It's everyone who believed in the possibility of change." Maya pulled up a graph showing the court's transformation over the past year. "These numbers are remarkable, William. The consistent reduction in sentencing disparities, the improved community feedback, the success of the mentoring program. Other courts want to know how you did it." "How we did it," he corrected her. "Without that traffic stop and your conference speech, I might still be the same biased judge I was before." They were interrupted by a knock. James, the clerk, entered with a young African-American woman in a business suit. "Judge Harrington, this is Michelle Taylor. She's one of our first mentoring program graduates. She just passed the bar exam and has been appointed as a district court judge in Atlanta." Harrington stood to shake her hand. "Congratulations, Judge Taylor. How can we help?" "Actually," Michelle smiled, "I'm here to help you. Atlanta wants to implement your model, and they're sending me to learn directly from the source." Later that afternoon, Maya stood at the podium in the courthouse's main conference room. The room was filled with judges, lawyers, and court staff from across the country. She was presenting their joint paper, Transforming Justice, a blueprint for addressing systemic bias in local courts. "What began with a traffic stop," she said, looking at Harrington in the front row, "has become a catalyst for national change. But the real story isn't about one judge or one incident. It's about what happens when we have the courage to confront our biases and the commitment to create real change." As she presented their findings, Maya remembered that day in traffic court a year ago. The frustration and disappointment she had felt then had transformed into something powerful, a partnership that was changing the face of justice in America. After the presentation, Harrington approached her with a newspaper. The headline read, "Justice Department Adopts Harrington Model for Federal Courts." "We did it," he said simply. Maya shook her head, smiling. "No, we're just beginning. Real change takes time, but now we have proof it's possible. As they walked out of the courthouse together, they passed a new batch of young lawyers arriving for the mentoring program. The future of justice looked different now, more inclusive, more aware, more just. Sometimes, Maya thought, the most powerful changes start with the smallest moments. A traffic stop, a conference speech, a judge willing to change. These were the seeds of transformation. And now, those seeds were growing into a forest of change, spreading across courtrooms throughout the nation.